Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast for this week. This week, we are talking to Dr. Robyne Hanley-Dafoe on how to make stress your ally, not your enemy. This is an amazing conversation and allows you to kind of reframe what stress can mean. It doesn't have to be a negative, it can also be information. So, learn more about that. Dr. Robyne does an amazing job, and as always, have a magical week. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Magical Learning Podcast for this week. As you'll be able to tell by the title, it's very exciting. We have a guest, and we'll get to them shortly. But first, we've got to check in with our regular crew and see what they're up. So, Grahame, how?
Hey, Jez. I'm well, thank you. I've had a really good start to the week. We were at home pretty much all weekend. Had a friend come down. We did a little bit of strategic planning for the business. Got on the mower and cut the grass. And the temperature is slowly starting to increase, which is both exciting and not exciting at the same time. But I'm good. Happy to be here.
That's awesome. Well, thanks, Grahame. Danette, how are you going this week?
Yeah, really good. Thanks, Jez. My book went back to the editor yesterday morning, so that's awesome. And I'm loving the spring weather. So very, very good.
Nice one. Yeah, the spring weather is definitely feeling nice here. Al, how are you going this week?
I'm really excited this week, Jez, because on Thursday I am off to New Zealand skiing with two of my daughters. Very excited.
Have
Al,
you
awesome.
told Renee that yet, Al? Does Renee know?
I did offer that Renee could come, but she and Gracie are going to Bali to balance things up and keep it even. Yeah, we're getting the best of both worlds as far as temperature-wise goes.
Nice. Good one. Well done.
Nice one, Al. And Al, what have you been up to? You've been off the ML podcast for a little while, so do you want to fill in our listeners on what's been going on?
I've been learning to be a Pilates instructor, Jez, and it's been such a great course. A lot of it is around us getting uncomfortable, actually standing up and teaching. And in the class, they did mention that we need to do 20 hours of practice teaching, and our biggest challenge will be teaching our family, which has caused a little bit of stress. So, yeah, it kind of ties into today's theme.
Great. Well, that's beautiful, Al. You've teed that up really nicely, and thanks for that update. I'm sure the listeners are excited to hear that. And Dr. Robyne, how has your week been?
My week thank you for asking. My week has been very full, actually, busy with lots of work. But we also just dropped our oldest off at university, and we're still navigating this new adventure of being a supporter from afar to a new student. So it's exciting times in our house.
Well, that's what an amazing journey. Congratulations. That's very exciting for you. That's awesome. Well, Dr. Robyne, we're so happy to have you on today. This looks like an amazing conversation, picked an awesome topic. But before we get into all that, for our listeners that may be being introduced to you for the first time, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And again, thank you so much for having me participate today. I was looking forward to this conversation. So my name is Robyne, and I've been studying human resiliency and wellness and high performance and stress for the last 20 years in a university setting. And I get to work with people all over the world, learning like strategies and habits to practice, really kind of thinking about how we work with stress and resiliency and our comebacks. And I'm also a super proud mom of 3 teenagers who keep me on my toes, keep me humble, keep me learning. And I'm joining you tonight from Canada. And I live in a community that's on the lands of the Anishinaabe First Persons of the Mississauga. It's treaty territory. I'm a settler in this space, and it's also known as Peterborough. So I'm joining you this evening from Peterborough, Ontario, land of the Anishinaabe people. And I'm so excited to dive into this conversation with each and every one of you.
That's amazing. And we're so excited to have you. It's always exciting to get any expert in. And I think you've picked an amazing topic. So the topic that you picked was how to make stress your ally, not your enemy. I think this is something that a lot of people deal with, stress in modern times. So before we get into the questions, I guess I want to throw to you, Robyne, what made you pick this topic?
Wow, that's a huge question. So the shorter version of why I study this is I think all of us scholars, we really study topics that we ourselves want to learn more about or curious about from a personal interest. And one of the things I recall as somebody who has studied human resiliency for, like, as I said, 20 years, what I got so really curious about is instead of always thinking about like, how do we bounce back when things go off course, or how do we like bounce back after rejection or disappointment or challenges, I was really curious about like, how can we almost imagine like having a proactive relationship? If we know things are going to be hard, what can we do before the bad stuff happens that really sets people up for success? And that really introduced me to this big world of like understanding stress in a pretty remarkable way. And I was so excited to be able to share this work with people.
Amazing. Well, I think that's just made me want to get right into the questions. So I think let's just start there. I'm going to start with Al. Al, what was your question? And tell us a bit about why you chose it. Oh, just on mute there, Al.
Thanks, Jez. I was jumping the gun. Robyn, is there a way to know if stress is helping or hindering us? And I guess it's, as a guy who has struggled with perfectionism a lot of his life, I've always, I look at, I guess, now that I've gone too far into that stress zone, but then I don't want to go back to the point of, no sort of stress or no drive. I'm wondering, how do we find, what is working for us and where's that middle ground?
Yeah, and I love that question. And I think the first way to kind of approach it is recognizing that stress is inherent to the human condition. When I hear people say that they want to live like stress less, that makes me a wee bit nervous because that's like a dead man goal, right? The only time in our life when we will not have stress is when we are no longer alive. So I think what you're asking is such a beautiful question about like, okay, so I want to be in a place where I'm like feeling activated and I have good focus and drive. And yet I'm not doing it at the cost of my wellness. And that's what we often see is that persons are really kind of in that tug of war of figuring out what does that balance. And we even use the word often in stress work around balance, but even the word balance suggests we're not on steady footing. So what I like to think about and knowing where is like, okay, where is that sweet spot for me is that place where I can feel deep integration, where I know that this is important and this work matters, but I can do it in a way that's like sustainable. And I'm still able to show up for the things that matter most in my life. And I can make what matters most matter most. So again, recognizing it's like, when can I be like actively pursuing those goals in a place of like deep groundedness and feeling steady versus doing this almost like this balancing act or a tightrope walk between both of those forces.
Oh, that's great, Robyn. I can so relate to that with the Pilates instructing where I'm feeling stressed, practicing teaching classes. Yet I can see that's going to lead me down a health and wellness path as opposed to coming home from that, I guess, burnt out or with a negative impact on my body.
Yeah. And one of the really coolest things that we learned when we dived into the research on our perceptions of stress is essentially there's this kind of belief that like stress is going to kill us, right? Like it's associated with like 95% of, different types of disorders. They usually associate stress in there. But what's quite fascinating, it's actually our perception of whether or not we think stress is harmful. So for example, if you're about to teach your first class to your family and you're feeling a wee bit of nervous energy, and maybe you're just feeling a little bit like, oh, what's the next right move? What do I say here? That's sending a cue to your brain where you can interpret that and say, you know what, this is telling me that this is important. This excitement is telling me that this matters and I need to give this my attention and I need to give this good energy. Versus if we think, oh my gosh, this stress is going to kill me. It's going to make me not remember anything. It's going to knock me off my game. I'm not a very good, test taker. I'm not a very good person in these situations. That's when we actually start to tap into the negative effects of a really overactive nervous system. And so again, our perception is actually more important than the actual type of stress we're experiencing.
Well, thanks, Robyn. Yeah, I love that contrast.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Robyn,
That's amazing.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Jez,
jump in,
Robyn, can I
Grahame?
just jump for a sec? So is that sort of there's a theory that the experiencing anxiety and experiencing excitement are literally the same sort of state in our brain. So it fires in exactly the same way. The only thing that's different is the label that we attach to it.
Yeah, absolutely, Grahame. You're 100% correct. So we're activating the same like receptors in our brain that's letting us know that this is important. So our nervous system has perceived something as a threat, whatever that might be, a new experience. And we then get to interpret whether or not that's going to be like that nervousness or that fear, or if it's going to be that anxiety or that excitement. Like we are the ones that put labels because the biological reactions are exactly the same. It's that lens in which we see it. And I'll give you a very brief example. I remember working with a group of young athletes, and I was talking to them about like what it feels like before you compete. And you might notice, and I was using language that was age appropriate for children. So I said, you might notice there's some butterflies in your tummy. Like you just might notice your heart rate starts to kind of speed up a little bit. Maybe you feel hot. And I was describing the physiological reactions. And this one little girl said to me, she goes, "Oh, is that anxiety?" And I said, "That's one word." She goes, "I thought that was my courage growing."
I love
and
that.
she said, "I thought that was courage growing."
Wow.
So for whatever reason, that little one had picked up messaging along the way that when she started to feel those physiological reactions, most of us would perceive that as like a negative, but this little one had heard that that's courage building up in your body. And so she would use that as energy that really let her know that this was important and she wanted to do her best.
Beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Wow, great lessons, and then that kid also teaching us a great lesson there, Dr. Robyne. That's what a great story. Thanks for that. I'm going to throw to Danette now. Danette, what was your question?
So I always have two questions because I love questions. So my first one is, are there times when stress will always be our enemy? So it might be a particular situation or something like that. So I'll ask that first and then I'll come back to the second one.
Yeah, what's really amazing about the human condition is that we don't like to feel uncomfortable. Like we do not like discomfort. We do not like pain. Our nervous system is designed to prevent us from having any of those experiences. So what's quite remarkable is that we learn very early on what are those triggers or those things that like we don't like, and we will go to great lengths to avoid them. So I think what's really important is to note that we all have like a different makeup, right? We all have a different makeup in terms of like what buttons, so to speak, we have. And what's quite interesting, often when we think about kind of those buttons that kind of, get us upset or make us feel threatened or makes us feel pretty stress filled, usually those have been like installed essentially in like certain seasons of our lives. And the people who installed them know how to press those buttons, right? So if it could be, let's say maybe your family ran on guilt, right? So all of a sudden there could be some situations where because your family was fueled on guilt, as soon as you start to notice that feeling of guilty, like that uncomfortable feeling, you're likely going to have a bigger reaction compared to somebody who didn't grow up with that as a currency or somehow that they tried to, work with our behavior. So again, being mindful that we have these triggers. But the really cool thing about these triggers, what I love about this is that they're always data. Right. So if we notice that, we're the thinker, we're not the thought. So if we notice like, whoa, I noticed part of me is really activated or really triggered by what's happening, that's going to give us really interesting data about learning about ourselves. And what I also love to talk about when we talk about triggers is on the other side of it, we also have this kind of idea about glimmers. Now, glimmers are kind of things that we can see or we kind of plant in our world that actually are almost like stress releasers. And we get to decide and design that. And I'll give you an example. I recall, so again, my kids are big now, but when they were little, I remember one morning, Danette, where everything that could go wrong with me trying to get them ready to get on the school bus that morning went wrong, even to the point where we missed the school bus. So I'm now driving these three said children to the school. And it wasn't the energy that I wanted to be sending my children out to in the world, right? It was just a lot of negative. It was just rushed and it just didn't feel very good. So, we missed the school bus and I'm strapping them into their car seats. And as we're driving, I recall being at this red light and just noticing the heaviness of the emotion that was happening. And I looked over and there just happened to be this large vehicle and the dog had his head out the window in the passenger, right? So he was the passenger, he had his head out the window. And I turned to the children, and again, they would have been like 4, 6, and 8. And I said, kiddos, today's going to be an amazing day. And they're like, and I remember Ava being like, it doesn't feel very amazing right now. And I said, but look, we just saw a dog with his head out the window living his best life. And anytime you see a dog with his head out the window, you know you're going to have a good day. It's like a universal sign. Now, what happened was then the kids started to laugh and we had this little discussion, this little glimmer we planted. And I recall Hunter, 19 years old, calling me, from his Bluetooth in his truck. And he's like, hey, Mom, my day was going awful, but it's turning around because I just saw a dog with his head out the window. And that was like 9 years later, right? So we can plant these little glimmers that actually act as stress releasers for us. And those little micro things, Danette, those are not that little after all. Those can actually change the course of our day if we know where to look.
Oh, I love that. That is such a gorgeous story. Thank you. And my second part of the question was, if there are, so anything where the stress really is always your enemy, are there things we can do to lessen that impact? And obviously the glimmer one is definitely one of them. Any other sort of tips around how we lessen that?
Yeah, my favorite suggestion to offer persons is to, whenever possible, cope ahead of time. So in our culture, we've really been conditioned that like something stressful happens, a busy week at work or a challenging situation, and then we have to try and cope, repair, do something to try and bounce back. My invitation, though, is the more that we can cope ahead of time, that easier it is to navigate that difficult season or that difficult challenge. So, for example, even if you're going into a really difficult conversation, right? What are things that you can do before that actually are going to help you feel steady and regulated and grounded? Maybe going for a walk, listening to a particular song, or even having a strategy for the first few minutes after that difficult conversation or that difficult meeting. Like block out 20 minutes so that way you can go maybe for a walk then, versus just jumping into another meeting or jumping into another event, like giving ourselves time to process. And the more proactive we can be when those stressors do come, we're actually more in a position to be able to navigate or stick handle them in a way that doesn't cause as much damage.
Nice. What a great answer. And I love that whole proactivity and thinking ahead. And I love that bit at the end too, Robyn, about creating that space to be able to have space to process and get back into that good headspace. So that's awesome. Thank you. And by the way, I'm halfway through your new book. Loving it.
Oh, thank you.
So
thank
good.
You, thank you. Oh. It's
There
in
we go.
Australia.
There we go. We'll have a moment at the end there to talk about that, because that's awesome. We've got the copy there. Very exciting.
We had a little package.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jez. We had a little package arrive on Friday. So thank you. And Gemma, whoever else helped make it happen. Really
I just want to hold space of how special it is to know that wee little book is like in Australia right now. Like just knowing that was a book that, I had written while, in airports and while I was in Canada and traveling all around North America, and just knowing that it was printed in Canada. I work with a very, very particular printing shop, a family-owned printer in Canada. And to know that book has been printed in Canada, but also made its way all the way to the other side of the globe. It's really special to see it there. So thank you for giving it a home so far away from home.
You're welcome. Thank you for writing it.
No.
Means a lot.
Thank you.
It's amazing. And, that's probably even, I would suggest to people that if they want to, book in, cope ahead of time, perhaps booking in time to read that book could be a good option there. I think that could be a good way to relax. So we love that. Let's go to Grahame. Grahame, what's your question, and tell us.
So my question sort of came about from lots of past experiences and some more contemporary ones. We have a tendency, I think, as human beings, to, when we experience something that, let's say we're just going to label as stressful rather than exciting, we seem to have a tendency to trawl back through our past experiences to see if we can find a similar situation. And it's we do it along the lines of, well, if I got through that, then I can get through this sort of thing, which can be problematic for some of us if you've had a relatively, low stress sort of experience up until now, and then something catastrophic happens. You don't necessarily have anything to fall back on. But so in that sort of context, my question was how important, and I wonder whether important isn't necessarily the right word now, maybe it's influential, are our past experiences in determining whether we view the current sort of stressful situation as an ally or an enemy?
Yeah, it's a
And did that
beautiful
question make any sense at all?
It did. Yes, yes, it absolutely did. And again, this is something I've been so curious about, because we know part of like human resiliency, our ability to be able to bounce back, requires us to have to go through difficult seasons. Like we actually have to experience loss, heartache, rejection, disappointment. And especially as, parents and supporters, here we are trying to create environments for our children and our loved ones so they don't have to go through those things. We want to protect them from this. Yet, what we know in that research is that like the lived experiences, it increases what we call our efficacy, or our belief in our capacity to be able to do those hard things and to be able to show up. So to me, it's always been this interesting conversation point about how do we like ensure that our children, for example, have enough experiences where they learn how to use those strategies in context, but without like necessarily like throwing them into these like dangerous situations where it's kind of, they have to sink or swim. So that's what I'm hearing in your question is like how much of that prior experience is really going to inform our capacity to show up. And I think what's really important is to recognize, like, to be able to be resilient and work with our stress, it doesn't mean we have to have gone through really bad times.
Yeah.
It's like understanding how to problem solve, how do we critically think, but also how to use our resources. So we know, for example, vicarious learning from other people who have gone through difficult seasons, letting them share their lessons learned can be very powerful, and letting other people to know that it's possible to get through this. Like we don't have to, for example, touch the stove and get burnt to know it hurts. We can actually watch somebody else or hear somebody else's story. We don't have to do all of those things to know. So our learning systems are very sophisticated with how we can learn it. And I think one of the things that is so important, especially with children, is that we give them the opportunity for them to know that we believe in their capacity to do the hard things. And again, what I mean by that is, I recall, even I was driving this I love carpooling kids when they were little, because that's where you get all of the good details. And I remember I was driving these kids to a basketball practice, and I was handing out juice boxes, as any good parent doing carpool would be throwing juice boxes behind them. And this one little child said, "Oh, can you open it for me?" And I was driving on a highway. And I remember Hunter, my oldest, looked at that little kid. He's like, "Dude, you'd be so thirsty if you wait for her to open anything. She will not do anything for you that she believes you can do for yourself." And again, that's, I think, how we can really encourage young persons to like, when are we going to be the rescuer versus the supporter? And if we lean into being the supporter more than that rescuer, kids can learn skills, and it doesn't always have to be the hard way.
I love that. Thank you. I'm assuming, Robyn, when you're describing being in a car on the highway, lots of kids in the back and throwing juice boxes, that would be lobbing gently with love.
Lobbing gently with love. Absolutely. Yes. Lobbing gently with love. I will just remind my children that everything I threw at them while driving was lobbing it gently with love. I'll just remind them. Beautiful.
And I love that the consistently communicating our belief in their capacity, their ability to learn their way through a situation, rather than doing what a lot of us have done with good intention, in that being that sort of helicopter, or what was the term Stu used, lawnmower parent, where we're just trying to remove all of the obstacles and hard things.
Yeah. And Grahame, if I could add just one other piece to that, I just, recently we had this experience where I think what's so important is that we have really radical clarity on how people need us to show up for them, especially with, as children age and our loved ones in our community. And I'll give you another example, if it's okay. If that's okay. I was having a little family huddle. I was chit-chatting with my boys, so 19 and 15. We were chatting one day in the kitchen, and then their sister came home from school. And she was in a mood. I'm sure you can, like a 17-year-old mood, girl mood. It's very identifiable. And I went to turn to the boys to let them know, like, let's give your sister some space, right? Because we got to be careful. And I turned around, Graham, and they were already gone. Like, they had already left the kitchen. And I was like, what about like leave no man behind? They left me. I'm standing there in the kitchen. And I turned to Ava and I said to her, I'm like, Ava, do you need comfort or do you need a solution right now? Because you're clearly going through something. And she turned to me, Graham, and she said, Mama, I need you to sit down beside me and I need you to hate math as much as I do. And I was like, sister, I got you. So I sat down and we commiserated on everything that is wrong with the grade 11 math curriculum. And when I noticed she started to re-regulate, I said, girl, what happened today at school that got you so keyed up? And she said, Mother, I was in English class, like language class.
Yeah.
And the teacher had asked the students, Ava, what was the last book that you read that made you cry? And she had said calculus. And all of the students laughed and they thought it was so funny. And she was like embarrassed, right? Like she was just so embarrassed that math was following her into some other classes. And what was what I was reflecting on that is this idea that if she told me she needed me to hate math, and I said, we're going to get you a tutor, we're going to just work harder, we're just going to, pull up those bootstraps and persist and march on, I don't think she would have felt seen. And I don't think she would have felt heard. So I think sometimes just asking, do you need comfort or do you need a solution is a way that we can show up so that way, not only are we imparting that we believe that they know themselves well enough to be able to say, this is what I need, but it's also allowing us to have that dialogue to say, I believe in you enough to know that I'm going to show up how you're asking me to. And one last little caveat, my husband has asked, why don't I ever give him that option of comfort or solutions? He doesn't understand why he doesn't get that option. So I'm working on that.
We probably don't have time to unpack that today. Though I love that. A couple of things, just thinking about when our eldest daughter was 16, 17, and she came home like that, I was locked in the broom closet faster than anybody else. And so then I was thinking, where the hell were you when, which is a completely inappropriate question because, but it would have been so wonderful to have some understanding around some of this when our kids were that age. So again, thank you. It's a beautiful story. It really is.
And also for your daughter, there's no support for year 11 maths here anywhere. I think we can all agree that it is bad. So we're all on board with that one.
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that your story there leads me right into my question. So I think let's jump into that one. So my question was, what are some ways to encourage people who are in the midst of being stressed and are feeling a bit overwhelmed? Sometimes you're around people and they're stressed, and I don't know what tool necessarily to jump straight to. So, I guess that was kind of my question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things that's so fascinating about our human condition is that when we're around people, and we talk about this idea about stress, but the way I like to think about it, it's really dysregulated, right? So our nervous system, it runs hot or cold, and like a cool nervous system, we know what that feels like. We feel confident, we feel effective. It's like being on your A game. You know what that feels like when you're in that place of calm and steady, and our nervous system is nice and cooled. But then things happen that really like activate or heighten or trigger our nervous system, and then it runs hot. And we know when our nervous system is running hot, our focus becomes very tunneled vision. We feel like we're the only person who has ever experienced this. Our pain is greater than somebody else's pain. Like it puts us in this very peculiar headspace. And one of the remarkable things about our human condition is we have these beautiful little factories in our brain called mirroring neurons. And our mirroring neurons are always scanning the environment to cue us in terms of whether or not this is safe, whether or not we're in danger. And when we're around a lot of people that are dysregulated, we can pick up on that. And we might not even be experiencing stress, but everyone around us is freaking out. So we're like, our brain says, well, you should freak out too. Like this is your best chance of survival. So what's really remarkable though, is when we recognize the more powerful signal that we can send is that place of a cooled nervous system and calm. And that's why, for example, our first responders, people we feel really good around are people who like come in and they have not an arrogance, but they come in with this confidence that like all will be well. We're going to walk through this, one right choice after another. And so what we can do for the persons around us, Jess, is really thinking about how do we stay in that place of grounded with that cool nervous system? Because when people are around us, we can actually help regulate people simply by just being a person who isn't kind of giving into all of those big hot type activations. And right now, I think the world needs that. We need people who just have that capacity to exhale and say like, wow, this is a lot going on right now. And I'm a well-resourced grown-up who's going to be able to figure this out. And I don't need to figure out all at once. And one of the other little pieces there too, our brain, a way of trying to make sure that we know our stress is like paid attention to. One of the ways that we know we're dysregulated is everything feels urgent. Like everything feels like it's important. Everything feels like it's on fire. But again, that's just our brain's way of getting it through all the noise and getting it to our forefront. So just even recognizing when you feel that urgency and you feel that frantic energy, that tired and wired energy, that's just data to let us know we need to do something to cool our nervous systems off.
I love that. And I really love the way of looking at it that it becomes data, because I know that our human brain is wired to like find information. So it's such a good way to look at it, to reroute it in a way where it's like, oh, this is information.
Yeah.
I'm learning something right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's awesome. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Robyne. Well, I'm going to jump into, I think this sort of also kind of goes into Kanika's question, which is, what does stress do to your body and how can you recognize this and turn to your advantage? Obviously, we've covered this a little bit, and I think that that person that was talking about growing courage is a good way, but is there anything else that might be relevant here?
Yeah. So we all have tells, right? So each and every one of us, our own lived experience is going to help us write a story about how our bodies experience stress and overwhelm and even like tiptoeing towards burnout. So I think what's really helpful is to just spend a wee bit of time whenever we are in actually a place where we're feeling pretty regulated, because we don't come, I always find it fascinating that, people are burned out or people are overwhelmed. And then we try to get them to think about what is it that you need right now in this moment. It's like, well, if I knew that, I wouldn't be in this situation. So when we're in a place where we're feeling pretty quiet, pretty chill, even just to kind of think about like, okay, so when I'm feeling angry, what does that feel like in my body? And what actually is helpful? Like, what is it that actually is helpful for me? Or when I'm feeling like, what are some of the, tall tale signs that like I'm kind of slipping out of that place of regulation? I can share with you one of the ones I know personally is I just get really clumsy when I'm in a place of overwhelm. And a very good example I can share with you, I forgot something and I came running back into the house and I went to throw my car keys and my phone on the bed, but instead I threw the travel mug of coffee on the bed, but I was still holding the cell phone and the car keys. And I just had a moment as I watched coffee literally spray across the the white bedspread, the wall, the curtains. In that moment, I just sat down, right? I was like, I'm just going to minimize the blast radius. And I literally just sat down and I said, I'm going through something. That's a lot. And instead of getting mad at myself or meeting it with like this, like, oh, this negative critic that I think a lot of us have, this critic inner dialogue, I like to lean into my inner coach. And what would my coach say? My coach would say, take a break. Like my coach would pull me off the floor if it was basketball and would put me on the bench and say, you need to just have some water. You need to make a better choice. So again, meeting some of our stress responses, knowing them, being able to know what our go-to tells are. And when we start to experience it, meet it with like abundance of compassion versus the judgment. And if we meet it with compassion and curiosity, we can start to really address it in a way that's more helpful than if we get really angry or get critical at ourselves, because that really hinders our process.
Yeah, beautiful. Great way to look at it. And I think if I was in that situation, I'm sure I would also have been trying to drink out of the keys or something. It seems like where my brain would have been.
Yes.
Awesome. Our final question here. Again, some of this has been covered, but feel free to sort of add anything to this one. This is from John here, and he asks, how do we control and use our feelings of fear and worry to our advantage?
Yeah, what interesting. Like, we're these fascinating little feeling factories, right? We are fascinating little feeling factories. And feelings, what I think is so important is to recognize that, again, they're data that gets information to let you know that this is important. So if we feel a sense of fear, it lets us know, okay, wow. So is this a matter of, am I feeling fear? Again, getting curious. Like, meet that fear, kind of almost like pull up beside you on the bar stool and be like, okay, fear, what are you really trying to tell me? Are you telling me that I need to level up or skill up because I'm actually out of my league? Are you telling me that this is really important? Like, are you telling me, like, just again, just getting curious and meeting those emotions? And again, the same goes with, anger or even overwhelm, right? Like, I always love just kind of imagining that sense of, like, instead of, just going on autopilot and like just pushing through the emotions, staying busy enough that we don't have to feel our feelings, just notice when those feelings arise, like pull up it, like literally invite it kind of beside you, pull up that chair and be like, okay, fear, okay, jealousy, okay, concern, or that scarcity mindset even. Okay, what are you trying to tell me here? What do you want me to know? And when we ask our feelings, what do you want me to know? It just allows us to show up in such a different way versus trying to like ignore them or block them or push them down.
Yeah, great insight. I feel like I've taken away so many notes from this conversation about different insights. Definitely for me, one of the big ones was glimmers kind of being positive triggers. When people are triggered, it's like the reverse. It's like you're instantly feeling better. I love that one. But I'm going to go around the room and grab everyone else's final thoughts. So I might start with you, Al. Al, any final thoughts you had on today's conversation?
Thank you so much, Robin. You've explained things so well, so many things that landed for me today. The one I'd just like to say back to you to see if I've got this correct, I love the idea of comfort or a solution, and it's believing in our children, or I guess it can be anybody. It's sitting with them in that emotional state versus, I guess, trying to fix is sending them the message that we don't believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's the kindest thing that we can do for our loved ones and our teammates and our colleagues is to just hold space for them, and trusting that they will figure it out, and just them seeing that they don't have to walk it alone.
Well, thank you so much, Robin.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Thanks, Al, and great questions today. Danette, any final thoughts you had on today's conversation?
I really like that exploration, and particularly what's the tell when I am starting to dysregulate, and that whole clumsy bit, and just thinking, okay, I need to spend some time noticing what that is for me. And then that whole bit about being compassionate, I think that's just beautiful. So thank you. Such a great talk. We need to get you back, by the way.
Oh, I love it.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you, Danette, and great question today. Grahame, any final thoughts on today's conversation?
Where to start? The the coffee cup on the bedspread, and this is just because I'm Australian and there's so much wrong with what's between my ears. But I'm instantly on a freeway somewhere heading from where you are to where you're going with a car full of kids, and something happens, and then all of a sudden you're lobbing mobile phones instead of juice boxes into the back seat. And kids, if you're listening, it was lobbed with love.
Loved with love.
I actually did one thing sort of jumps out time and time again, and it's just around the importance of self-awareness, of being able to stop and check in to see where we're at and what's going on. And I love our emotions, our feelings are just data, it's just information. So that the metaphor or analogy of just pulling up a stool and saying, what do you want me to know? Fantastic. We haven't got anywhere near finishing this book, by the way, folks. For those of you who are not watching, who may be just listening, the book that I'm holding up is called Stress Wisely: How to Be Well in an Unwell World. Jez will tell you all about where you can find a link to buy it. If you're in Australia, hit me up, and if I've got a spare copy, I'll send you one. Robin, if you're up for it, I'd really, really love to bring you back on and actually explore the book a little more. The one thing that jumped out at me in what I've read so far, and I think this is important in the context of today, and the conversation today is the idea that, because I'm guilty of this, hugely guilty of this, well-intentioned but not very necessarily well-informed, of telling people, clients, friends, colleagues, families, that when things are starting to feel overwhelmed, when it starts starting to feel too much, and your level of resilience is dropping, then the first thing you need to do is practice self-care. You just need to take care of yourself, and that will help. But I think I've overemphasized or exaggerated just how helpful that alone can be when the environment that you exist in destroys whatever positive impacts of that self-help. And it reminded me, what's the name of the book? Stolen Focus. Johann Hari, I read it last year, and he was talking about this idea of cruel optimism, where we're saying to people, all you have to do to be able to manage with everything right now is just practice self-help, self-care. Just practice self-care and you'll be fine. But the reality is you can do the self-care thing at home and you can feel great, and then you go out to wherever you're going to. And so it's a really rambling thing. I'd love just your thoughts right now on what else needs to happen, because part of it's our responsibility, but part of it is the responsibility of our employers.
Yeah. Grahame, you're asking, it's not a rambling question at all. What I'm hearing is just such beautiful thought about understanding that we are in very complex times. And, I rock the boat a wee bit. I try not to rock the boats often, but I did rock the boat recently when I wrote an article that said, telling someone who's experiencing a big stressor or a trauma is like telling them to self-care their way out of it is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, right? It's like, here somebody is just bleeding out and you're like, have you tried a cup of tea? Have you tried going to the gym? Right. Yep. Have you tried essential oils? They'll make your problems smell better. Right. Like, it's just so cruel how people don't understand how real and raw the human experience is right now for so many people. And just telling them to self-care their way out of it is so, it's really, in my opinion, it's so destructive. And the reality is looking after ourselves, or what I like to think about is self-stewardship. What is it that I have to do that's going to increase my stress tolerance to a point where I can manage my busy, full life right now in a way where my wellness is still intact? So I have to take that role of self-stewardship. And again, that proactive approach we know is so much easier than doing retro approaches. What is it that I have to do in my own self-stewardship to show up for this? But then recognize that there are other persons that are also culpable and accountable for systems that are putting people in positions that require this amount of resiliency and self-care. So again, I think what's really important is just recognizing, acknowledging. And whenever there's this big, what we call a wicked problem, like a problem our current mental health status of our employees, our family systems, we know we're in a very unwell time. Where do we even start with wicked problems? It is just with that awareness building, awareness building and naming it. This is hard. This is difficult, versus again, telling persons to, kind of self-care their way into a place of that toxic positivity, which unfortunately is that we're seeing quite rampantly. And I share with persons just one kind of last takeaway. One of the things I got curious about in my research, Grahame, is when people are really in that place of feeling just really kind of overwhelmed, the heaviness of their life is starting to really push down. What are the things that actually help? And the first one, and there's 5 of them, and I'll tell you them just briefly. The first one is solitude, right? Actually having some time to be alone with your thoughts, even getting a little bit bored, turning off the technology, actually just having some time. And there's a difference between solitude and loneliness. Solitude is intentionally creating this safe space for me to just go deep and figure it out. Loneliness is not by choice, right? I'm alone, not by choice. So the solitude, isn't disconnecting in that way of human connection. It's I'm choosing to shut it down, take some minutes and tap in and ask myself hey, Robyne, how are you really? Right? Not just how are you in a pleasantry. It's Robyne, how are you really right now? And just go deep. So solitude. The second one we learned about was the power of connection, to actually say to someone I'm not okay. And it's okay to not be okay. And instead of always just trying to put on that stoic or brave face, actually find a trusted person where you can lay down your armor and say like, hey, I need somebody else to carry this for a minute. Like I just need help. And then the other three, really quick, we learned about the power of nature, right? Getting outside. And I love how they write about, a walk has never solved anyone's problems per se, but it won't make them worse. So, sometimes just getting outdoors, it does so much for our brains on a lot of levels. The number 4 one we actually learned about was the power of music. You're like one song away from feeling better. So when you're in that place of just overwhelmed, just finding that one go-to song, like what's that anthem song or even just that, the saddest sad song you possibly can listen to just feel that sadness validated, right? Like just find that song, use music. It opens up all these other areas in our brain that allows this oxygen-rich blood to give us energy and renewal and focus. And the last one we learned is the power of gratitude. And the best way when we're really feeling the weight of the world, one of the ways that we can lift ourselves up is by helping somebody else. And it's awesome. Again, we get really selfish, and that's not a bad thing, but we get very selfish and overwhelmed. Like we're just trying to look out for ourselves, which from an evolutionary makes sense. But one of the best things we can do is turn around and see whose hand we can hold and to help somebody else. And we learned that those 5 forces, those are consistent for people to actually feel better when the weight of the world is heavy.
Beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Robyne. Before we go, though, I want to grab, first of all, your final thoughts on today's conversation and how to make stress your ally, not your enemy.
Well, my final thoughts are just the power of community and how much I've enjoyed, even though we're so far apart, that we can create a place to have these conversations in the power of community. And I don't know about you, but I feel like my bucket's pretty full. So thank you for spending time with me and inviting me into your community. And again, ultimately, we're not meant to do any of this as alone, right? We need one another, and we're not meant to do any of this alone. We shouldn't have to do it alone. And people want to help. And so being in community is a beautiful way to really think about managing our stresses in a way that actually can make it so the weight of it doesn't have to get carried by just 2 hands.
That's beautiful. And I mean, I feel like I've taken away so much from this conversation. I'm sure all of our listeners have as well. Before we go and before we let you go, if people have listened to this, they've gone, you know what, I need to talk to Dr. Robyne, or I need to read the book. Do you want to tell us a little bit about where's the best place for people to reach you, and or maybe just give us a little bit about the book as well?
Yeah. Well, thank you for this. So the easiest way, it's Dr. Robyne on the website or social, whatever is easiest. And it's Robyne with an E. It's Robyne. It's Robyne with an E. And the book, very much what I would hope people can hear, the intention when I put together Stress Wisely and all of my work, is I want to braid theory with practice, but with real world stories, like case study stories of my kids, of my lived experience, of just that wisdom that we share, because storytelling, I think, is the most powerful form of pedagogy and teaching. So any of my work that you come upon, you'll see that there is that research, it's science informed, but it's also braided together with practical ideas and just lots of real world pieces that hopefully this makes sense to all of us. So I would appreciate, I appreciate people checking out. And again, I'm just so appreciative that our paths have now crossed. And I don't think that happens by accident. So I'm excited to see what's next for all of us.
Likewise.
Amazing. Well, what a great conversation. All those links are going to be available in the podcast description. If you want to go check out all of that, please go click there. There's so much to find out. To everybody on the podcast today, what an awesome episode. I had a blast. And to everybody that's been sharing this and listening at home, have a magical week.